Welcome to another episode of the Corrosion Journal interview series. My name is Sammy Miles, and I'm the managing editor-in-chief of Corrosion Journal, AMP's peer-reviewed scientific journal. We're continuing our series on corrosion and health with today's conversation on biomedical corrosion. I'm joined by Jeremy Gilbert with Clemson University and Silvia Ceré with Intema. Thank you for joining me today.
Hello.
Hello, thank you for inviting us.
Now, before we dive into today's discussion, can you provide a little information about yourselves for our listeners? Why don't we start with you, Silvia?
Okay, my name is Silvia Ceré, as Sammy said. I'm from Intema. Intema is a material science and research institute from Argentina. And Intema depends on the National Research Council, which is called CONICET, and the University of Mar del Plata, Argentina as well. I'm chemical engineer as my first degree, and then I did a PhD in material science. I've been working in electrochemistry from my degree, but devoted mostly to corrosion in some completely different fields from biomaterials. I began to study biomaterials 20 years ago, more or less, and mostly devoted to materials, to metallic materials in the body. At that time, from permanent material from processes, and now we are doing some research related with temporary materials.
And how about you, Jeremy?
Yes, so I'm a material scientist as well. Got my PhD at Carnegie Mellon back in the dark ages in the 1980s, and have had faculty appointments at Northwestern University and Syracuse University. I'm now an endowed chair in the bioengineering department at Clemson University, and I direct a program in bioengineering between Clemson University and the Medical University of South Carolina, where I'm positioned in Charleston. I'm also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Biomedical Materials Research, Part B, Applied Biomaterials. And my interests in metals go all the way back to my graduate school days and biomaterials specifically, and have been working in that field since graduate school. I was the past president of the Society for Biomaterials several years back.
Thank you both for joining me. And now, when we think of the human body, corrosion isn't usually what first comes to mind. So to start us off with, what are some examples of how metals, alloys, and materials are used in the body? And to piggyback on that, which metals and materials are generally used?
Sure, I can answer that. So metals are used in the body for many purposes having to do with implants for the most part. And implants could be things in your mouth, like a dental implant, to hip replacement or a knee replacement, even heart valves, cardiovascular stents, fracture fixation screws and plates to hold your broken bones together. There's many devices that are relying on metals to perform their function. And mostly that's because you need very high strength. You need something that's going to survive under large loads, many times, cyclically applied. The metals we use, and we'll talk, I think, a little more about this, are permanent metals, ones that we intend to go into the body and stay forever, and others that only meant to be there for a shorter period of time. In the permanent metals, we rely on really three major alloy groups. The steels, stainless steel, in particular a 316L stainless steel, a type of stainless steel, a cobalt, chromium, molybdenum alloy, and there's some variations on that theme, and then titanium-based alloys. And the major ones are either a pure or commercially pure titanium, a 6 aluminum 4 vanadium alloy that gets used fairly extensively in orthopedic implants. There's also some specialty titanium alloys, a nickel titanium alloy known as nitinol, or a shape memory alloy. And there's variations of these around. And so I guess one thing I need to say is when I started as a professor at Northwestern, I was in the dental school, and really dentistry led the way for maybe decades in introducing metals into the body and being the source from which all of the other fields of medicine have drawn to bring metals into those areas. So a shout out to the dentists.
Wonderful. And Silvia, do you have anything to add?
Well, as Jeremy said, was permanent implants and degradable, permanent and degradable or temporary implants. And this depends on the use that they are going to be in the body. The permanent implants are the ones that Jeremy said, mainly those group of materials, which are very few. If you think in the periodic table, there are very few elements that are combined in many ways, but there are very few elements that are allowed in the body. And for the degradable or temporary implants, there are other materials that should be dissolved in the body and they don't have to do any damage in the body. And the way with these permanent implants that they corrode and they have this passive film on the surface, and that's why they are good for using into the body. Because of this very thin passive layer that they have, is that we can use them. And so there is a kind of thing that they are good because they corrode, because they have this passive film. And that's why we can use them.
Now, speaking of corroding, what leads to the metals corroding in the body? And
Well,
Silvia, do you want to start us?
Yes. The fact is that we are a very corrosive media. Our body is a very corrosive media, so corrosion matters. And corrosion matters because corrosion is a surface phenomenon. And the implant surface is the one who is going to be in contact with the body. And as our body is a very, very corrosive environment, it's going to try to corrode any metal that we are going to put it. So all the efforts that they are done in the field of implants are done in trying to improve this surface to avoid corrosion.
And Jeremy, anything to add?
Well, yeah, so Sylvia did a good job of explaining that, corrosion actually generates this little oxide film, this passive film on the metals, the permanent metals that go into the body, and it acts like a barrier. It's sort of a protective layer that sits there and reduces the rate. It doesn't stop the corrosion, it just slows it down so that these alloys, the titaniums, the stainless steels, the cobalt alloys, really have a very slow corrosion rate, one of the lowest that we can get out of most of the alloys that are developed today. And so they work well in the body because they are very low corroding rate materials. And the body environment, as Sylvia mentions, is very aggressive. Now, I tell my students, we are like a bag of salt water, right? We're like ocean water, only a little more dilute. Ocean water is about 3% sodium chloride. Our bodies are about 1% or 0.9% sodium chloride. But really, there's a lot more in there. There's inflammatory molecules. There's other chemistries that the body brings to bear, depending on, is there an infection or inflammation or just a normal environment? Where is it in the body if you're in the mouth? So the environments are very different and can be very extreme, even above and beyond being like ocean water. And then the other part of corrosion in the body that's really important is it tends to be, when it gets bad, it tends to be somewhat synergistically developed with other processes at the surface that could include wear phenomenon, rubbing, and disruption of that oxide film that then leads to much higher rates of corrosion of these alloys.
Great, thank you. And what are some of the potential health concerns if a metal corrodes in the body?
Sure, I can start. I'm sure Sylvia will have some things to say. So all of these metals corrode to some extent. And so you get some corrosion. Now, it could be much higher rates in some circumstances than others. And the product of that corrosion is oxidized metal. can form into either an ion that gets out sort of as an atomic charged atomic species, or it can react to form a particle of some kind, an oxide or a phosphate particle or some other kind of particle. And so you have corrosion products that are both solid and ionic. They can get out into the surrounding tissues. Maybe the particles can get embedded in the surrounding tissues. And again, it could go from very few, very little to, in most circumstances, to more severe, more aggressive. And oftentimes, well, let me back up and say it happens to all of them, all of the devices we tend to see in orthopedics, and it doesn't always lead to a health effect. So you can have some corrosion and degradation going on, and the patient will be perfectly fine. And indeed, for most cases, that's what happens. Sometimes you get enough debris or enough ions that you might begin to see other effects that show up in terms of the clinical behavior, like the patient begins to sense something, some pain, some inflammation, loosening of the implant, other things that can go on that are usually the diagnostic method to decide or understand that maybe corrosion and degradation are leading to a clinical circumstance where that implant needs to be removed and replaced or something done to help mitigate that problem.
Yes,
Silvia?
and yes, I think that besides of that, which I agree completely, is sometimes there are some metallurgical problems with the alloy itself, not with the patient, but with the alloy before being implanted. It has already problems because of the grain size, because of the impurities, because of the surface is not as it should be. And so being in such a corrosive environment, it promotes corrosion, and sometimes it could lead to the fail of the implant, to a fracture of a crack that can propagate because of initial failure in the implant. And this is not, fortunately, is not a very, very frequent case, but it could be if the controls on the implants are not very well provided. And it's because the synergetic effect of the surface, which is not the proper one, and the corrosive environment.
Yeah, that makes sense. And are there times where we can leverage biomedical corrosion for our benefit? So we've talked about, some of the things that it can have on the body, some of the issues, which may or may not be severe, but is there anything good?
Well, it's not always bad, as you said. Sometimes the corrosion could be good, something that is looked for. In the case of the temporary implant, it is which is already looked for. It's all the research in the degradation of the implant is devoted to have the degradation of the implant in a time which it is, let's say, in a time that should match the regeneration of the tissue or the regeneration of the osseous tissue, or whatever is going to be regenerated in the place where the implant is put. This is the easiest way of doing this biomedical corrosion is in our benefit. But it's not very easy to get that, because when you put one of these degradable materials, it has to have a degradation rate that had to be the right one for the purpose that is going to be in service. If you are thinking in a osseous tissue, it has to wait the mechanical property, has to maintain until the bone has already consolidated. But if you're thinking in a nerve conduct, for example, for regeneration of peripheral nerve, it has to wait a little bit more for all the nerves to be regenerated and guided into this guide. So it's not that easy, but it's a thing that we have to work on.
Yeah, Sammy, there's some other possible benefits from corrosion. And if we take corrosion to mean electrochemistry generally at the implant surface, so one is, for example, silver, metallic silver is sometimes used to try to mitigate any infection. And it's because the silver ions can have an effect on the bacteria and basically kill the bacteria that might be growing nearby. And so there's a lot of effort these days to create silver releasing implants or material surfaces in the body to try to address infection. And then there's some others that are kind of interesting electrochemical phenomenon. One is there's a device called a direct current electrical bone stimulator. And that's nothing more than a stainless steel implant or rod that gets placed near a fractured bone, and you apply a negative voltage to it with a power source, and the electrochemical reactions at that implant surface stimulate the bone to form more quickly. And some other research that's going on is taking that same concept and using it to generate molecules at the surface in the solution that are reactive oxygen species-like molecules that can destroy a bacterial biofilm on an implant surface. So you may be able to, if you, for any reason, get an infected metal surface, you might be able to eliminate the infection by an electrochemical process. So there are a number of ways that one can utilize or manipulate electrochemical processes to the advantage of the body. And just one last thing to bring a little biology in here. Biologists talk a lot about redox homeostasis for living materials. So your cells in your body like to be in a balance, an oxidative reductive balance. And when you introduce metals that engage in oxidation or reduction or both, they can influence that redox homeostasis of the biology. And I think there's a lot yet that we don't understand in how we can either monitor or control that sort of tissue reaction by electrochemical processes.
Thank you both. Those are all really interesting corrosion behaviors that are positive, because I think we think of corrosion in general as always a negative, and there's so many good uses for it as well. Now, with that, what are some of the challenges with studying corrosion behavior of metals inside the body?
Well, so maybe I can take this one. I've spent a long career trying to study corrosion in the body, in vivo. And the way we do that usually is it's a little roundabout. The implant that was in the patient has to somehow come back out of the patient. And we call that a retrieval or revision surgery. So the patient needs to go into a second operation and they have to remove parts of the metal implant. And then at that point, the engineers like me can get a hold of them and try to study how the surface appears and trying to determine from that and knowledge of the environment and the mechanics and so on to figure out what are the factors driving degradation, corrosion of these particular implants. So this is an area of study called implant retrieval analysis. And I've spent many, many years looking at devices that have come out of patients to try to characterize the nature of the damage and the degradation that goes on. And what I'm amazed at is how the body figures out to do such severe corrosion on implant metals that are so corrosion resistant, titanium alloys that are just tremendously corroded when they're in the human body, even so much so that it's difficult to understand in the laboratory what are the factors that led to the kind of damage we're seeing in the devices coming out of patients. And so a second step of this trying to study it is you learn from what comes from the implant, and then you try to go into your laboratory with knowledge of the human body and create circumstances in the laboratory that represent that circumstance, and then study the corrosion that goes on there. And it's a challenge, but you can do it. And we've learned a lot from from that sort of connection of what really happens in the body, and then how do we reproduce it in the laboratory.
Yes, I agree with that. And I think that when I study the corrosion of implants, the in vitro trying to reproduce the in vivo conditions is the great challenge, because we have many, many variables. The immersion time of the devices when we have to simulate it in the lab, the electrolyte, the gas content, the flowing conditions, the proteins, yes proteins, no proteins, gases, what kind of gases, which pressure, and talking about the implant itself, the surface finish, the sample geometry, the immersion time, among many others. That's why it's so difficult to reproduce the conditions of the body in the lab, and that's why sometimes it's very difficult to reproduce and to answer the question that many medical doctors and the companies ask to us as how long is going to last these processes. And this question is the most difficult question to answer, because the Faraday law is not very easy to accomplish in this kind of experiments, because most of them they don't corrode but generalized corrosion. And so this question is not very easy to answer. And most of the time what we can do is trying to reproduce, as Jeremy said, all the conditions in the lab, and then try to see what is the phenomena that is occurring on the surface, not a number of how long is going to last this device, but which kind of corrosion is going to be promoted on the surface. It is going to be generalized. It's going to be the alloying of some elements. It's going to form any kind of product on the surface. That's the thing that we try to simulate in the lab. And then, because it's not possible to do accelerated assays in the in vivo, so it's not that easy to say, well, we are going to try this implant in vivo and we're going to see what happens, because the accelerated assays are not possible to do, because they are on real time. They are performed on real time. And what we do in the lab is trying to reproduce it and trying to do the assays in an accelerated way, to say, well, it's going to degrade in such and such way. And that's, I think, that is the very, very challenge, the very hard challenge that we have, the ones that we work on that and in this field, because we have many, many variables to work on. And that's why I think we have so many different results among many laboratories, because the variables are not fixed, so we cannot compare all our experiments. That's why I think it is a challenge.
I couldn't agree more. You said it very beautifully. It is the critical challenge for regulatory bodies, which, like the Food and Drug Administration, they don't create the tests. They just evaluate the test that the companies might bring to assess their devices. There are standards organizations that try to create these tests in the laboratory to represent what goes on in the body. But as Silvia points out, it's so complicated in the body. My body is different than your body, female, male, old, young, infected, inflamed. There's so many different ways in which your body may interact with the metal. It's very hard. And then even if you could represent a typical body, you might see some element of corrosion, but it doesn't necessarily say the patient is going to suffer harm, because again, you can have some corrosion and not have that implant fail per se, not taken out as a result of that. And in other circumstances, maybe it does lead to issues that require you to remove that device. And so it's hard. You can't do the experiment in the body. You have to try to simulate it in the lab, but these implants last, hopefully, for decades. So you can't do a corrosion test for decades to try to figure out what happens. And if you try to accelerate it, now how do you know, what are the tools for acceleration? You could raise the temperature, you could lower the pH, you could add an inflammatory molecule. But you don't, how do you link that accelerated condition back to your typical patient? It's very difficult. It's a real challenge. And it's actually some areas that I'm working on now to try to understand how you can link back to an accelerated test condition, something relevant to the body environment. And it is a major challenge, and it makes it hard to understand for the companies to design their implants properly. It makes it hard for the regulatory bodies to assure that something's going to be safe and effective. And so this really is the kernel of issues around the successful use of metals in the body.
Taking both what y'all said here and a comment Silvia made earlier about the actual, like the grain of the metals and other things that can cause an implant to corrode or fail. So you not only have the environment that we're dealing with, right? The human body, and everybody's body is slightly different and all the variables that go in there. But then you also have, is the metal or implant itself that we're studying the same? So to further complicate your research comparing apples to apples, not only do you have an environment that's going to differ, you might have a metal that differs, even if they are on paper supposed to be the same thing, but maybe there's some imperfections on one, or the surface prep is different or something like that. So yeah, it sounds really, really complicated to get.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can give you an example. So we talk about cobalt, chromium, molybdenum alloys used in the body. Well, there are cast alloys, so people will cast those. Typically, a knee implant has a cast cobalt chromium alloy. They could be wrought alloys. They could be wrought with high carbon or low carbon. And they could be a powder metallurgy product that's then hot isostatically pressed to form a component. And now, more recently, you could use things like selective laser melting to do additive manufacturing of these alloys. And all of those will get you completely different microstructures. So not just grain size, but you might have more carbides in one than another. The carbides might be of different chemistries. They might affect the surrounding carbide regions, the grain boundary regions. Big changes go on to the microstructure. And of course, that can influence how those materials will corrode in a particular environment in the body.
Yes, and in the same line, perhaps the account of the elements is the same, because the quantity of carbon is the same, the quantity of chromium is the same. So you do only because of the content of the elements. Perhaps it's the same, it's equivalent among them, but they are forming different carbides, or they are forming different second phases, or they are forming different microstructures. And so the behavior, the corrosion behavior is going to be different. And that's why this is, although it is a two-sides phenomenon, media and metal, this metal can have a lot of variables, and the media also. So it's very hard to work with that.
Thank you.
We have to take all that into account. And so I think that what's the good thing, let's say, because something good has to come up after that. The good thing is that we have to know it. And so we have to point it. Well, we are working on this condition and this condition, and so we can compare with that condition that we're working on. And it's not all the same. And so when we have a paper, or when you have a product coming from a company, or whatever you have to do, you know what you have to see. You know how to research. Although we have to know what we have these different things on hand.
Yeah, that's a good point. We need to know what all the properties are and the conditions are, so that we can try to compare them. I'm going to pivot slightly, and we've touched on this a little bit. But if an implant is suspected to be corroding, is the solution to replace it, or do we leave it in place, or does it just depend?
Well, actually, as Jerry said, Sherry said before, it's not the necessity to replace it. It depends. Corrosion is going to be. So all the materials are going to be corroded. And it depends if this corrosion is having some harmful effect on the body. If it is the case, it's going to be replaced. But if it's not, if nothing is happening in the any repercussion on the body, on the health, is not going to be replaced because replacement is major surgery. So we all want to avoid that. So if the corrosion is not having any harmful effect, it's not the solution to replace it. But if it is, well, the only solution is to replace it.
Here, maybe I can give you a short story that might help to frame this. And so I had an example that I came upon where a patient had a hip implant. And, the hip implant is like a spike that goes down your femur, and it has a ball for the ball and socket joint. So this femoral component, it had broken down in the spike down inside the femur and was broken in half. And the patient had no idea. They went to their doctor for a typical follow-up. They took an x-ray, and the doctor came in and said, "Oh my gosh, your implant is fractured." And the patient said, "I don't feel a thing. I'm walking just fine." And so the question is, if the patient doesn't feel it and they are able to continue to walk, even though it's broken, and there are many circumstances like this with screws and fracture fixation devices, that the screw holds a plate to your bone to help it heal. The screws may break, but the plate is still working. And so in those circumstances, it's not always the case that you go in and take it out. The doctor may decide, there's more potential harm in trying to go in and remove that than leaving it in and having the patient be not clinically affected by it, not, being able to walk on it and whatever, not feeling pain. So, corrosion doesn't mean the implant needs to come out, and all implants corrode some. And we don't have good ways right now to independently measure, like, how corroded is it, right? We don't have tools today to monitor the implants to say, oh, this one's corroding fast. I think that's a place for future research to kind of explore onboard sensors that might tell you how corroded a device is. But right now, we don't have those. And so patients only will have their implants revised or operated on if the surgeon thinks there's a clinical reason why, and it doesn't have often anything to do with corrosion.
Thank you both for clarifying on that. What are some recent advancements and developments in the field?
Oh, I guess I'll go. So there's a couple of areas that I'm interested in that I see big progress on. And one of them is the utilization of additive manufacturing techniques for metals to make implants. So you can imagine the possibilities here. You could make an implant for an individual. You could make an implant that has a very complicated structure, maybe a mixture of alloys together to make that structure. You can try to address specific problems that can often arise. Like in an orthopedic case, say a joint replacement case, you might have somebody with a condition like dysplasia or some other joint deforming effect, and you need a special implant that will work in that spot. So you might imagine there making something with additively manufactured materials. So I see that as, and in fact, it's in the research phase right now. There are companies that are making many devices that are these 3D manufactured devices. And one of the main reasons is we like porous structures to go into against bone, because that porous structure leaves open space where bone can kind of grow in and grab a hold and anchor that material. So the metal and the bone integrate by a biological fixation process. So if you can control the structure of the porosity, you can promote this bony ingrowth, just as an example of where some benefits to additive manufacturing are. in dentistry, additive manufacturing allows you to make very complicated structures in your mouth for partial dentures and other structures to help carry some of the dental, the artificial teeth and whatnot. And even in dental implants, there's a role to play for additive manufacturing. So that's an area that I think is going now and into the future. Maybe there's, as I said, the monitoring, being able to do onboard sensing of corrosion phenomenon, even control of the electrochemical state of that surface to promote particular things. These are areas that I think are innovations that are still maybe a few years out, but on their way.
Yes, I think that these tailored implants is going to be a very good thing when they are in the market, and they are for all the people that want to have these devices, these tailored devices. And in the field, I think that these temporary implants, they are very, very much studied now. And well, these temporary implants are the ones that they are supposed to dissolve in your body once their purpose is already achieved. And so I think this field is going to have a very good impact in the future. And also the surface modification, although there are many surface modifications of many kind of implants already in the market, this surface modification, they are always working on surface modification for improving in the case of bones, the bone ingrowth in the implant, either with molecules that they have to be attached to the surface as peptides that they want to improve the anchorage of the tissue to the prosthesis, either in dental or in orthopedic implants. And also these materials that comes for spine surgery for trying to regenerate nervous tissue. I think that nervous tissue is going to be one of the fields that metals is going to be more involved in the next year.
And are there other areas that we still need additional research in? I know y'all talked about several of the things you mentioned are things that we've been researching, or maybe they're making their way into the industry. Are there any others that really could use somebody to dive into and start exploring and see what we can learn?
There's so many places to go.
Yes.
It's just really beginning. We've been studying metals in the body since over 120 years ago, at least, maybe 150 years. And even still today, we are just scratching the surface in the abilities of these metals to help the human body overcome disease or disability. One area I would imagine is in the area of electrodes. So, we haven't talked a lot about it, but there are electrodes that one can place inside the brain to do deep brain stimulation, either for pain or for perhaps depression or even Parkinson's. There are things like that. There's more and more efforts at creating electrode arrays that are typically conducting electrodes that might help with restoring vision. The brain chip interface is a big area that will rely heavily on electrodes that are typically metal type electrodes to do. And so beside the big implants, there are these other places. And we've used metals in big joints like the hip and the knee and the shoulder. And more we're hoping or looking at, can we do a finger joint, or can we do really small metal devices that can promote a particular orthopedic outcome? And so looking at alloys that allow us to kind of reduce the size of the plate and the screw and whatnot, so that it still has enough strength, but can be small enough to fit in these small areas. So it's just, there are many places where one can envision metals advancing medical treatments.
Yes, I agree, because there are many things where metals can be used. As Jeremy said, in the electrodes, I think that is one of the most important things that we are going to see very big advances in the next years. Because this electrochemical potential that metals are able to measure, and this electrochemical potential that metals are able to transmit to the guide of electrons, I think that this point is a very good starting point, either for brain, for central nervous set, when you with the head, I mean, and the peripheric nerves also. And so I think that metals are going to play a very good role, a very important role in all that systems. Of course, they are going. There is still playing. There are things that they are not replaceable yet for any kind of material in bones. Although ceramics are very well studied and many other materials are studied, I think that metals, with all this new knowledge that we have about the metals being more porous, as Jeremy said, and trying to get the structure more similar to the bone, I think that metals are not going to be replaced by others because of their mechanical strength, their corrosion resistance, and they have many advantages in front of other materials. That's why I think that there are many things for doing with metals and combining different alloys, trying different surfaces. All the things that we said when we are trying to reproduce these laboratory steps in order to have a good performance in the body are the same that we have to achieve in our materials. We have to have the best surface so the cells could like the material, and we colonize the material, and they do the materials one thing with the body. And so it's our challenge to do that. This strange body is not going to be a strange body. So I think that is one of the things that we have to focus on.
Wonderful. And thank you both for joining me today. And if anybody had any follow-up questions or wanted to get in touch with you later, what's the best way for them to do so?
Well, for me, you just have to Google my name and you'll find me at Clemson's bioengineering department. And I think my email and phone number are there, so easily found.
And for me, if you have my name and you go through Intema or CONICET, there are my data there. Although perhaps the web page is in Spanish, the email is there.
And with that, I'm Sammy Miles here with Jeremy Gilbert and Silvia Ceré, and thanks for listening to another episode of Corrosion Journal's interview series. You can subscribe to AMP Podcasts if you haven't already on Apple, Google, Spotify, and all the major distributors. If you want to learn more about the journal, please visit corrosionjournal.org. You can also find all episodes of AMP Podcasts on amp.org. That's ampp.org. We'll be back soon with another episode. Thanks for listening.